Where I left off 2 weeks ago was to talk about the Schleitheim Confession. Just 2 years after the first Anabaptist baptisms outside of Zurich in January of 1527, or 1525, excuse me, a group of Anabaptists got together and created this confession of faith. It's kind of amazing that only 2 years had gone by and they were able to come together as a group and say, this is what we believe. It's also amazing in that in all of church history, basically before that, edicts had come down from on high. The Pope, the clergy had said, this is the document that we have created for you, and this is what we believe. Well, the Anabaptists, as you know, believed in a priesthood of all believers. Everybody participates in interpreting the Bible. Everybody participates in agreeing on what we believe. Well, if you looked at the Anabaptist world this week, the cover story, John Roth, my former colleague from Goshen College, is on the cover, is about a new project called the Bible Project. And what they're doing is not a new translation of the Bible from Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, but a new English language Bible with commentary throughout the Bible that has been developed over history. It's an effort to have introductory, helpful materials as you read the Bible from the Anabaptist tradition. Larissa Good, one of the pastors from Trinity in Phoenix, says, "It is my conviction that we are on the cusp of a new Reformation. One of the key features of this Reformation is a new understanding of authority and our relationship to Scripture. The authority comes from Jesus, and the relationship is with Jesus, but not only Jesus, also the person sitting next to you in the pew." This idea is consistent with the core of Anabaptism. No pope, no priest, or other clergy has a monopoly on the interpretation of Scripture. We now have a priesthood of believers. Understanding the gospel is best done in the context of church. So in this project, 500 lay groups across the church are going to come together and study the Bible from a broad spectrum of Anabaptist faith communities. These groups will share their perspectives, insights, and questions. And by 2025, the 500th anniversary of the beginning of Anabaptism, this new Bible will be developed. Well, let's come back to Schleitheim, the first Anabaptist confession. Put together in Switzerland in February of 1527, it was written 2 years, as I said, after the beginning of the movement. Very quick in comparison to other traditions. The Lutheran took 13 years before they developed a confession of faith. Why did they do it so quickly? Well, there was an urgency because there were ideas surfacing that were not particularly scriptural. In fact, the whole Munster revolt that I will talk about in a few minutes involved a group of people wanting to bring in the kingdom by force. So the Anabaptists said, we need to put our ideas together on paper and develop a confession of faith. It's 7 articles, rather simply summarized what the Swiss and South German Anabaptists believe. The first article affirmed baptism as the basis of Christian faith. Other articles concern excommunication and the ban, church discipline, communion. And this one specifically said that if you're not part of the church, you cannot take communion. Separation from the world, leadership by shepherds, non-resistance, refusal to bear arms, and the rejection of swearing oaths. The aim of the Anabaptists was the creation of an entirely separate church the members of which would be forbidden to associate with Catholics and Protestants. Could we say that this document is the beginning of Anabaptism? Well, yes, for the South. It did spell out in some detail what the Swiss Brethren, the people in the South, believed. It was adopted by them, but it was not universally received by all Anabaptists. Situations were different in different areas of Europe, and we will see later that other confessions of faith were developed. Shortly after, Michael Sattler was the person, the Anabaptist, who put the document together, who wrote the document. Shortly after he put this document out, he and 13 others who helped write it were arrested, tortured, eventually sentenced to death. Sattler was given the opportunity to hire a lawyer in his defense, and he said, "No, I need no defense. A believer must be ready and willing to defend himself." Like many of the other martyrs, on the day of his execution, he was tortured, his tongue was cut out. Like Anniken Hendricks that I mentioned last week with the gunpowder in her mouth, they did not want him to make a public testimony at the day he died. Cutting his tongue out prevented that. He was torn with hot irons and eventually burned. Well, I said there are other centers of Anabaptism, and the one in the north is particularly important because that's where Menno Simons come from. Menno was a Dutch Catholic priest who joined the movement as a Catholic priest and slowly began to adapt the Anabaptist ideas. The remarkable thing when you know his story is that he became a priest, and it was 2 years into his priesthood before he ever opened the Bible. He never read the Bible until after he was priest for 2 years. When he began to read the Bible, he began to have questions about things like transubstantiation, this idea that when you have communion, the bread becomes the actual body of Christ, the wine becomes the actual blood. And he was a little concerned as he began to ask these questions. Well, am I going to go the direction of Luther? Am I going to go the direction of Zwingli? But the more he read, the more he said that biblical authority ought to be primary in the life of the believer. By 1528, he was known as an evangelical preacher. From his doubts about the Eucharist, Menno began to gradually move towards Anabaptist positions. Positions about infant baptism, the meaning of church membership. He began to have a firm conviction that only persons of mature faith who acknowledged Jesus as Lord and counted the cost of following him could be eligible for membership in the church. The experience of conversion became central to Menno's thinking. Well, Menno was baptized in 1537, became a leader of the people who began to share his name. He was not the founder of the Mennonite church. Sometimes people say that. It's his name that's associated with our tradition. He was deeply troubled by what was going on in the north in the city of Munster. From 1534 to 1536, there is this experience in Anabaptist history that most of us are a bit embarrassed about, sometimes don't like to talk about, but it was a reality. Some of the early Anabaptists thought the kingdom was coming soon, Christ's return was imminent. There were people like Melchior Hoffman who said, God is coming back, Christ is coming back to Strasbourg in the very near future. Well, one of his disciples said, no, it's not going to be Strasbourg, it's going to be Munster. Jan Matthijs declared that Munster in northern Germany was going to be the new Jerusalem. The kingdom was going to become there. Matthijs took the radical decision to take over Munster by force, military force, to kick all the Catholics, Protestants out, take over their homes, take over the government, the city government. They punished, persecuted anybody who didn't go along with it. If you refused adult baptism, you were persecuted by the Anabaptists of Munster. Well, Matthias is eventually apprehended and killed, but he's succeeded by another man, Jan of Leiden. Leiden had visions about God and this absolute power that he had in the new kingdom. He introduced polygamy, and there were other things that were problematic in addition to the use of force. He was eventually killed, but thousands had joined this movement. Catholic authorities eventually surrounded the city, took it back by force. Jan of Leiden is arrested, troops take over the city. If you go to Munster to this day, you see these 3 cages hanging from the cathedral, front of the cathedral. Leiden's body and several other people who worked with him were put in those cages and were there until the bones, the body decayed, the bones were taken out, but the cages are still there to this day in Munster, to remind people of this awful history of the attempt to take over Christianity by force. Well, Menno was very discouraged by the Munster Rebellion. He did everything he could to say, this is not us. We are not part of those people who want to bring in the kingdom by force. He wanted peace, and he did everything he could to accentuate the peace tradition. He was very influential in Northern Europe, and it's because of his preaching about peace, about a more normative understanding of Anabaptism, that by 1546, his people, the people who were Anabaptists in that part of the world, became known as Mennonites. One of the issues that comes up because of this need to disassociate with these people who wanted to bring in the kingdom by force was to advocate the use of church discipline to the point of shunning, banning people. He said the unrepentant, excommunicated Anabaptists who espouse violence had to be avoided in social and personal relationships. Christians need to shun or avoid the unrepentant. Well, there was a division between the Dutch Anabaptists of the north and the Swiss Anabaptists of the south on this issue. In the south, there was a lot of persecution that continued long after things settled down in the north. And some of the people who supported the Anabaptists, who took them into their homes, who advocated for them publicly, were called the true-hearted. And the people in the south said, how can we condemn these people to hell? How can we not have anything to do with them? They've been so kind to us. So the south was much less interested in shunning than the north. The question became, is shunning necessary? And that question is still part of the Amish tradition. The question still is, do we put people out and have nothing to do with them, never allow them to eat at the table with us ever again? The most strict Amish to this day have this practice of strong shunning, where once you're excommunicated, you're never allowed back. Many other more progressive Amish, most Amish, have what we call soft shunning. One leaves the church, joins another church, a related group. One is allowed to have fellowship with them again. We'll come back to that issue when I talk about the Amish division of 1693. Well, the issue of shunning, putting people out of the church, comes to a head with the second confession of faith. Schleitheim is in 1527, and 1632 in the north, the Dordrecht Confession of Faith is written. It has 18 articles, and the last one is about shunning. And this reflects the more southern position. The church was still to feed, clothe, and otherwise help excommunicated members who are in need. The church should not view the shunned as enemies, it cautioned, but rather should ask the erring to amend their lives, to be reconciled to God and the church. This confession, the 1632 confession at Dordrecht, is the one that the Amish to this day adhere to. And as you know, probably, before a young person is baptized, or 9 Sundays before baptism, they go over 2 articles of the Dordrecht Confession of Faith each Sunday until their baptism. life in the north was better by the 17th century. The last Dutch martyr died in 1574. Holland gained independence from Spain. William of Orange said that Mennonites should be left alone, no longer forced into military conscription. He wrote a letter to the authorities saying, "Leave those Mennonites alone." Life in the South, however, was very different. It continued to be very difficult for the Swiss brethren. Executions ended, but Anabaptists were fined, imprisoned, sent into exile. Some of them were even forced to be galley slaves on ships in the Swiss Navy. Among the most difficult places for Anabaptists at this time was in the canton of Bern in western Switzerland. The authorities tried to systematically rid their region of Anabaptists. At the same time, in the early 1600s, there is this awful war going on, the 30 Years' War. In many areas, the farmlands were uncultivated, destroyed as a result of war. So the Anabaptists who were in the South, who were down here in Switzerland, began to move north. There's the Rhine. They followed the Rhine north into what is now called the Alsace, eastern France, and into this area that's called the Palatinate. Descendants of Swiss brethren had one choice: to move, to find another place to live, to survive on the land, or starve. They couldn't own land. They were forbidden from being able to own land, but they were allowed to be tenant farmers. And they had a very strong reputation for being honest. A letter to the King of France in 1712. The Anabaptists apply themselves with extraordinary care to agriculture, an occupation for which they have admirable knowledge. They've cleared in the plains as well as in the mountains a very large quantity of land, and so on. Jean Séguy is a French sociologist who's written a lot about the Anabaptists in Alsace. Unfortunately, his books are in French, and a lot of this hasn't been translated into English. Another local official in Alsace said they manage the estates of lords and nobles who prefer them above all others because they can profit more from them and because they pay their fees more precisely. There are these laudatory comments about these farmers from the South who've come into Alsace, who've come into the Palatinate, are honest, who are doing really well as farmers. They innovated. They created new breeds of cattle. Because the Anabaptists were not able to own land, they could do things that farmers on the land who owned it couldn't. They brought clover. They improved soil quality. They used manure more effectively. More and better crops led to stall feeding. Well-fed cattle led to more meat production. They improved meadow culture. They developed a new form of cheese, Gruyere cheese. Palatine, that area north of Alsace, is the area where the Pennsylvania Dutch language that the Amish still use and Mennonites have used in the past. Well, so I'm going to pick up that story next week, or 2 weeks rather, and talk about the movement to North America. What I want to do now is turn to the Hutterites. There are 3 groups that descend from the Anabaptists: the Mennonites, we've been talking about, the Amish, we will talk about, and the Hutterites. There are these 3 centers of Anabaptism: the Swiss brethren of the south, the Dutch in the north, and those in central Germany, and that's the connection to the Hutterites. Again, people down here in Switzerland were severely persecuted. I talked about some that moved up this way into Alsace and into the Palatinate. There was another group that went over into what is now Austria, into this area. And that group we know as the Hutterites. It's a long story. They started in the Tyrolean mountains in western Austria, moved up into what is now Czechoslovakia, moved over into what is now Hungary, to Romania, up to the Ukraine, into Russia, and in 1874 to North America. Well, because of the persecution in Switzerland, these people left. People in South Germany left, went over to this area because Liechtenstein was offering them a place to live. One of the scholars in South Germany who had an influence on this movement was Hans Denk. He was a scholar who trained in German universities. He knew Latin, he studied Greek, Hebrew. He was also influenced by the humanist. At a very young age, he was the master of a school, but he lost his job because he had some ideas about baptism and communion that didn't go along with the local authorities thinking about these issues. He didn't like Luther's emphasis on justification by faith. Just have faith and all is well. Denk said, faith is important, but it must be followed by evidence of a moral life. He said that no one may truly know Christ except one who follows him in life. No one can follow him except he first know him. For Denk, discipleship was really important. He was unhappy with what he considered to be a lack of evidence of faith in the lives of Protestants. The Anabaptists stressed moral living, and that attracted people to their movement. Another core idea of Denk's, which is really important, is the de-emphasis of self. He believed in free will. People have free will. But one needs to lose oneself in the community. Here are the roots of both the Amish and Hutterite concept of Gelassenheit that persists to this day. The individual must always accept the will of the community over the independent spirit of any single person. From little children on up to adults, we are part of a community that's more important than any individual. Well, Denk died in a plague in 1527, but he met another important person, Hans Hut. And Hans Hut had some ideas about the imminent second coming of Christ that he likely got from Münster. But he also said personal suffering is a part of being a Christian. The sharing of worldly possessions is a part of Christian life. Hut was baptized by Denk, wandered around central Germany, preaching in farmhouses and forests and towns. After 2 years of ministry, he was arrested and died in a prison cell. Well, to come back to the Hutterites, Denk and Hut had an influence on those people who were in Western Austria, in the Tyrolean region. For a while, they could live there, but Emperor Charles V said Anabaptists were to be exterminated by fire and sword. So those people left Austria, moved up in what is now Czechoslovakia, was at the time Moravia. And as I said before, Liechtenstein was this prince who was giving people a safe haven for a period of time. In Tyrol, in that mountainous area where people were fleeing, another man comes on the scene, and his name is Jakob Hutter. He probably was a hat maker. That's where he got his name from. He organized small groups of migrants who fled Austria under very difficult circumstances. And at some point, as they were leaving Austria into Czechoslovakia, the group of people in flight laid down their coats on the ground, put all their possessions together, and said, from now on, we will hold property in common. The Hutterites have one of the oldest and most complete histories of their movement, the Hutterite Chronicle. And this story is in the Hutterite Chronicle. That book is in a colony in South Dakota, the Hutterite Chronicle. So they went to Czechoslovakia, didn't last long there. They were persecuted there. They were expelled from villages. They fled to the fields and forests. They were driven around like herds of sheep, according to the Chronicle. Ferdinand, the king, put a price on the head of Hutter. He was arrested, tortured, burned to death at Innsbruck. Not all the nobility, however, went along with the king, and they continued to allow these people who lived in colonies, what they would call Bruderhofs, where a group of people held property in common, worked together to eke out an existence. Between 1529 and 1621, 102 of these communities, these colonies, were developed in what is now Czechoslovakia. That period of time in Hutterite history was known as the Golden Period. They couldn't own land, but they could live on land given to them by nobles, and they began to apply the crafts that they brought with them, bookbinding, rope making, pottery, and many other skills. They developed this incredible pottery that it persists to this day. It's called Hutterites pottery. Beautiful stuff. They developed education. The Hutterites have had a profound respect for education. They were very interested in the training of children. It's believed that the Hutterites invented the kindergarten. John A. Hostetler claims that they have little schools and big schools on a Hutterite colony. The little schools are essentially daycare places. The big schools are for education. He claims that Hutterite little schools were in operation 270 years before kindergartens were first set up in Germany. As soon as a child is finished nursing, he or she goes off to the daycare in the community. Education has been important for the Hutterites, is still important. On a colony in the past, they always had a German teacher who taught German, who did some minimal religious instruction, and then they had another teacher. They used to bring in an English teacher, somebody from the outside, to teach children on the colony. Now more and more, especially among the progressive Hutterites, teachers are getting a college education, some of them by remote learning. One of the functions of school is to orient a child towards community life. Very early on, a child learns submission. Submission to the will of the community, to give up their own impulses. They use the expression that I've heard Amish people use: what has to happen to a child is that the will of the child must be broken. And for the Hutterites, by the time a child picks up a comb to comb his or her hair, we know that their will needs to be broken because they have a beginning of an individuality there. Very young children will fold their hands together in the presence of food anytime food is put in front of them, in an attitude of prayer. They learn that early on in life. I need to stop because we're past 11:30. Next time, I'll quickly get them to North America. I'm not going to go through all the details of all this moving through Moravia, Czechoslovakia, Romania, etc. Their last stop was in Russia. The Mennonites aided them to get there. They lived near the Khortytsa and the Lechna colonies. I'll pick it up from there in 2 weeks. Thank you.